A few weeks ago, Yevgeny Prighozin, the leader of the Wagner paramilitary group who tried to overthrow members of Vladimir Putin's government, died in a plane crash. His plane was shot down 2 months to the day after his attempted mutiny. No coincidence there. Something like this is shocking to the average American, but it's business as usual for most of the rest of the world. Today, I am joined by Dr. Matthew Schmidt, a professor and expert on Russia, to discuss what's going on in Russia, where the war in Ukraine is headed, and how the United States should deal with a figure like Vladimir Putin. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that you're having a great week. Just a reminder about the posting schedule of this YouTube channel. Every Mondays you can see a Dennis and Julie episode. Dennis and Julie is my show with Dennis Prager. It premieres on Mondays at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And then Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays you can catch Timeless episodes also at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And then sporadically throughout the week, I will post these Julie noted news videos about the more timely subjects of the day. So thank you all for coming back to this channel, and it is great to be with you. You can also follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter in case you just want more content from me than you're already getting. I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Matthew Schmidt to the show. He is a professor of national security and political science at the University of New Haven. He's an expert on foreign affairs with a focus on Russia and Ukraine. He has actually lived in Russia. Dr. Schmidt has also taught strategic and operational planning at the Army's Command and General Staff College. He's consulted on doctored maps of a downed Russian jet with the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he's been a representative to Ukraine's post-revolution presidential election. He is the co-host of Impolitic, a national security and international affairs podcast. Hi, Dr. Schmidt. Great to be with you.
It's good to be back, Julie.
Those of you who may be wondering how I know or discovered Dr. Schmidt, I actually interviewed him when I guest hosted for Dennis Prager's radio show a few months ago, and we had such a great discussion, and you're obviously so informed about this subject that I wanted you on my show. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here. So as indicated in the introduction, the news has been covering the fact that Prighozin, the head of the Wagner paramilitary group, was axed by Mr. Putin. Before we talk about the significance or the ramifications of that incident, can we go back to June 23rd when he tried to initiate that mutiny? Can you tell us what that was about?
Yeah, let's go back a little bit further. Prigozhin was the head of this private military corporation called the Wagner Group. It was formed under the auspices of Putin. Prigozhin was Putin's childhood friend and grew up making money with Putin from government contracts that were corrupt. And he was given the task of forming this private military company in order to do things where the Russian state needed plausible deniability. When the Ukraine war came around, Prigozhin led a group that was essentially the most competent on the battlefield. And at a certain point, Prigozhin started to argue publicly that the Ministry of Defense was not supplying his troops, as opposed to regular Russian troops, with enough supplies. This never reached the point of criticizing Putin directly, but criticized everyone else around him. And then finally, in June of that year, he accused the Russian army of directly attacking Wagner company barracks. And it was after that point that he decided to lead a group of men, about 5,000 in total, is sort of the best estimate now, north, apparently towards Moscow, where eventually he decided to stop several hours outside of Moscow and suddenly end up in Belarus and have his company essentially be disbanded over time by Putin. So that catches it up to June. And then what happens lately is that Prigozhin is free. He's moving about Russia. He's moving about Belarus. It's unclear if his operations in Africa, which are critically important financially to him, are continuing. And then eventually he's on this plane to Tver, which is his home region, when oops, the axe comes down, a wing seems to be sheared off, and Putin, his top aide, and another 8 of his senior commanders die in a plane crash.
You mean Prigozhin died? I believe you said
Prigozhin,
Putin.
yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Prigozhin.
Many
yes.
would wish that
Wishful
it was
thinking.
Putin
Okay.
instead
Yes.
of Prigozhin, but yes, indeed, it was
Yeah.
Prigozhin. So the Wagner paramilitary group, according to my understanding, was founded in 2014 when Putin originally invaded Crimea and then also sent forces into the Donbass region or the eastern region of Ukraine. Is that correct?
Yes. So again, we go back to this term, if audience remembers it, called the Little Green Men, where Russia said, hey, we didn't invade the Donbass. It wasn't us invading Crimea. We were invited in by the locals, and those guys were in green uniforms, the little green men with guns. They're not, Russian army people. Look, they don't have patches. They've officially resigned, things like that, until they were outed on social media for doing stupid things, posting and geolocating themselves and saying things like, I was paid to take a vacation and bring my weapon with me. And so those were Prigozhin's guys.
And so you mentioned that the Wagner paramilitary group is in Africa, and that seems kind of confusing because why would a Russian group want to go all the way to that continent? What's the answer to that question?
Yeah. So the first answer is money. Prigozhin personally makes a ton of money from his control of gold mines and other resources there, including the trafficking of illicit substances and human beings. And the second thing is that he's supporting Putin's foreign policy there to do what China's doing, right, which is to spread Russian influence in developing countries, especially since he can't really do that in developed countries because of the sanctions. So it's become much more important in the last 2 years.
Right. And I read that the Wagner group was at least claiming that it was helping countries like the Congo, like Burkina Faso, Mali, in fighting Islamic terrorists or violent perpetrators that are coming into those countries. Is that right? That's what the Wagner group claims to be doing?
Yeah, they claim to be doing it. They are doing that to some degree, and they're doing lots of other things, but argue to a greater degree.
Right. Okay, so Prigozhin was the head of this Wagner group, founded in 2014 to go take over Crimea, go into the Donbass, also has these operations in Africa to imperialize, essentially, Africa. And he dies in this plane crash. Now, on that June 23rd attempted mutiny against Putin, as you just told us, he said that essentially Putin's government wasn't providing adequate support to the Wagner troops in Ukraine. Was that a legitimate claim by Prigozhin? Was it true that they were not helping their allies in the war?
I think it was, and I would be careful to say that I don't think it was an attempted mutiny, or rather, I don't think it was an attempted coup, right? Definitely they mutinied in the sense that they went against, their commander's wishes, right, in moving towards Moscow. But we don't know. And I frankly think it's highly unlikely that his intended target was Moscow and the Kremlin. He's not stupid. He knows he didn't have enough men to do that. I think he was sending a signal about his displeasure, but I don't think he ever intended to topple Putin.
That's important to note. Yes, thank you. So what does this killing of Prigozhin mean? Some people are saying it's kind of insignificant. Something like this happens all the time. Others are saying that this may make it more likely that the Russian population may become incensed and go against Putin. What's your assessment of the ramifications?
I think on the battlefield, the death of Yevgeny Prighozin is not that great. What you see is that his company was already being disbanded. Even if he were alive and in Belarus, he was not going to be allowed back into Ukraine to command his troops. So I don't think it changes the effectiveness of Russian troops on the ground much. I think it's hugely important in terms of what's going on in Africa, or I should say, could be very important. Right? We don't know if there's a leader in the wings here who could replicate what Prigozhin was doing there. And I think it's even more important because you have to think of this. Remember that video, right, of the plane coming down, right? As a podcaster, right, it was perfect, right? The angle was perfect. The capability of the videographer was perfect. And you have to wonder, wow, how does that happen?
Right.
And here's what you have to think about. That plane is flying, and all of a sudden you see a boom and you see the wing shear off. Now, if you're Sorokin, right, who's the head of the Russian Air Force, who's now under arrest, who was seen to be a close not conspirator maybe, but supporter of Prigozhin, you know about planes. You know that most accidents happen at the beginning and the end, right? At takeoff and at landing, and that they generally don't involve wings falling off the plane. You also know about missile hits, you know about explosives. The Kremlin doesn't have to say anything. You watch that video and you think, okay, right? There's only one reasonable explanation for this. And every single one of his military commanders is reading the same message. This is important because Putin has reestablished his willingness to kill his senior commanders, his capability to have people carry it out for him, right? And it's important to recognize that Putin's not weak. He's not going away anytime soon. There's not going to be a coup against him because he still has the loyalty of the security services. If you see an event like this happen and not get pulled off, and people are saying it didn't get pulled off because people in the FSB or the GRU didn't want to do it, now you know he's weak. Now you know he's in trouble. We see no signs of that yet.
Is there any way that this decision could work against Putin?
Sure. It could make people decide, okay, we're next, and we have to do something to stop this. But the problem with that, to geek out for a minute, in political science, is called the collective action problem, right? So the first person to stand up and do that is almost certainly going to be killed. If 100 people stand up at one time, right, you can't get 100, you'll lose, and you'll die. But it's very, very hard to get 100 people to stay up and stand up and do that at one time, because each one is worried that the other 99 will not be there when they stand up, and then they'll be the one left. So it could happen. It has happened. I personally see no indication of that happening anytime soon.
How is the war in Ukraine going for Russia and for the Ukrainians?
It's messy. It's muddled. The Ukrainians are gaining tactical victories. It seems like they might have gained a little bit more than a tactical victory, sort of a theater victory in Zaporizhia a few days ago, where they have, one of the commanders said, we think we're getting to the second line of defense. In other words, we've gotten through the first line of defense and all the minefields and everything we've been hearing about. The second line of defense should be weaker than the first line, and that implies that the Ukrainians are finally getting somewhere. At the same time, we know that the Russians are massing mobilized troops to the north of where the Ukrainians are having the success. They're massing troops back up in the Kharkiv region, where the Ukrainians had success last year. And so it's sort of unclear what happens strategically. The bottom line for the Ukrainians is that they have a bigger lift than the Russians do. They have to win. They have to take it all. The Russians just have to hold on, and they don't have to hold on to all of it in order to force negotiations that are to their advantage.
There's obviously a big debate here in the United States about whether the United States should continue to fund the war. Well, I shouldn't say fund, help fund the Ukrainian effort in this war. We have given already $118 billion. There are people who are saying we've done enough. We need to devote our resources to the problems in the United States, and we need Europe to pick up the slack. And then there are others who say, let's go back to the 1930s and remember that we appeased Hitler and let him annex, land after land, and then we saw how that turned out. If we don't stop Putin here, it will be a repeat of what happened, and that he will continue to expand and expand. Personally, I don't have an informed opinion about this at the moment. I see both sides. As an expert on this, where do you stand?
Let me correct some misperceptions that I often see out there. The U.S. is not the only country that's funding the war.
Right.
Europe has funded a great deal of it. The U.S. has actually spent, if you look at the calculations, more than $118 billion. But whatever it is we've spent total, however you want to calculate that, it's not straightforward. It's not more than 0.05% of the U.S. total budget. 0.05, not 5. Not 0.5, 0.05. It's actually quite a minuscule sum. And people need to be careful when they talk about this to remember how tiny that amount of money is, to set this up there, right? And this money would have been spent one way or another in American foreign policy, just not to Ukraine, if Ukraine hadn't happened. Secondly, I think this is critically important. There's really no place better we could be spending this money. Conservatives and Democrats alike want there to be more democracies in the world. Both parties disagree with absolutist regimes, right? Both parties believe fundamentally in liberty, right? They might differ on some of the differences in what that means by liberty to do X or liberty to do Y, but they fundamentally believe that human beings, as individual human beings, have rights that should be, right, extended because you're a human being, right? That's in our Constitution. That's in the Declaration of Independence, right? We've spent 250 some years, right, reaffirming those ideas, and that's exactly what's being defended here in Ukraine. Ukraine isn't backwards. Ukraine is a democracy. Ukraine is corrupt, right? It was 120 out of 140 on the Transparency International corruption rankings just a few years ago. But Ukraine is getting better, right? They're working to clean out their government. They're working to restructure their private sector. Frankly, everybody is quite patriotic now and understands that the levels of corruption that they engaged in before are not going to be possible anymore. And why not? Because we won't spend the money if it is. We have very, very strong anti-corruption measures attached to the money that we spend, and government knows that if it wants that money, it has to enforce them, right? And that's what you see doing, right? So like, Zelensky fired his best friend from government, not too long ago, and every once in a while you see these waves of firings that go on. That's actually healthy, right? That's good for the country, and that's what's being defended here. And it's the exact opposite in Russia. Russia is a mafia country. It is run by one man, one man's ideas, one man's rule, right? There is no freedom of expression, right? There's no freedom of religion because he's persecuting, right, non-Christian Orthodox religions, including many American evangelical groups that are in Russia. And so, if you believe in any of those things, there's clear right and wrong here. And it's not been this stark, right? It wasn't this stark in Iraq. It wasn't this stark in Afghanistan. It's not been this stark since World War II. That's how bad the Putinist regime is.
Before we continue with this discussion, I'd like to quickly tell you about MyPillow. Mike Lindell has a passion to help everyone get the best sleep of their life because getting good sleep is necessary to be a happy, functioning, healthy human being. That's why he created the Giza Dream bed sheets, which, by the way, I sleep on. They are incredibly comfortable. I also sleep on a MyPillow. I have a MyPillow mattress topper. I wear my slippers and I use my towels. And you can get all of these products at a discount if you use the promo code Hartman, which is my last name, spelled Hartman. For a limited time, you will receive 60% off of the Giza Dream sheets. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You will receive a set for as low as $39.99 with the promo code Hartman. And also for a limited time, with any purchase, you will get Mike's soft cover book free with the promo code Hartman. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listeners square and use, you guessed it, the promo code Hartman, or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman to get deep discounts on all MyPillow products. What's fascinating to consider is how the collapse of the Soviet Union plays into this, where I was born in 1999, so the Soviet Union was gone for several years by that point. But at one point in American history, and recent American history and world history, the Soviet Union was this great power, not only with the vastness of Russia, but 14 constituent Soviet socialist republics, and then essentially these Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union went from having that huge reach to collapsing, and then you're left with Russia. So I can imagine that this, I'm not condoning Putin's, aggression or worldview. I'm trying to understand his worldview. He probably views Russia as having a profound loss in power and influence, and that's what he wants to regain by invading Ukraine. But is there evidence that if he succeeds, even to some extent in Ukraine, that he will go on? I know that he's talked about, I want to regain some of these other lands. Is that all bark and no bite, or is there really a bite there?
I do not think that he will extend this beyond Ukraine.
Interesting.
he said at one point, he said the greatest geopolitical catastrophe was his word, catastrophe, of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. What he meant by that was not that he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union, which is how it gets shorthanded, in the mainstream press too often. What it meant was Russia was a great power, a world historical level power, right? Changing the course of mankind and these sorts of things. And that collapsed along with the collapse of the Soviet Union because you couldn't separate Russia from the Soviet Union. And his goal in doing this is to reconstruct that sense of Russian power, right? Without reconstructing all the 14 constituent republics of the SSR, of the Soviet Socialist Republics, right? And so that's what I think needs to be made clear. He no longer thinks that he can take Ukraine physically, if he ever did. I'm not sure he did. But he certainly was trying to decapitate, quite literally, Zelensky and his government and put somebody in place and politically control Ukraine. And he probably is still trying to do that now, but his methodology is going to be more long-term. If he controls enough territory, then he can influence Ukrainian politics, and eventually he hopes 5-10 years down the line, turn it back east towards Moscow instead of west towards the European Union. But don't make any mistake, right? Putin hates Europe, and he hates European values. Some of the values that Americans on the right hate, Putin hates them also. So Putin and those Americans are in concert, right? But the difference here is that those Americans are not willing to create, autocratic rule in order to get what they want, right? And Putin is. And he's willing to do that, I think, in Ukraine, but he knows that it's too far to go anywhere else. He's not going to take, he controls Belarus functionally right now. Belarus has a very strong opposition at the same time, and I just don't think he's going to go march into Paris.
Well, I agree that he's not going to go march into Paris, but he may go march into Poland or Kazakhstan. But you've said that you think he'll stop at Ukraine. Is it because he hasn't succeeded? It's been a lot harder, or just he doesn't want those places?
Well, this is where money spent on defense, which often looks, like too much, right? Oh, we're giving money to all the Europeans and the Ukrainians and whatnot, is actually far cheaper than waging the next war. And he's not going to go to Poland because Poland's in NATO. And if he's learned anything on the ground, he's learned that he can't defeat the Ukrainian ragtag army. And he sure as heck is not going to be able to defeat NATO. And so he's not stupid, right? He's not really going to go into Poland or anywhere else because he doesn't want to trigger NATO's involvement in the war. His hope for victory is to slow roll Ukraine into having to negotiate, right? And then to scare off NATO from allowing Ukraine in. That's how he wins if he wins.
People on the right and the left here in the United States similarly detest Vladimir Putin. That's obvious. But there are some who say that if you look at things from Putin's perspective, it was not wise for the United States, however well-intentioned we may have been, to encourage and try to pave the way for Ukraine to join NATO. Putin had been very clear over the years that he did not want NATO at his doorstep. And under several of the past administrations, Democrat or Republican, it was a United States foreign policy objective to get Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Was that a wrong thing for us to pursue? Is there any credence to that view that we may have contributed to this invasion by our however well-intentioned actions?
To quote John McCain, right, it was the right thing to do, right? That's why we wanted Ukraine in. And NATO's policy, let's be clear, it is NATO's policy, it has been NATO's policy since the formation of the organization, right, to invite in any interested member that passes the standards. It has an open door policy. That is not a policy that was created under Ronald Reagan. It is not a policy that was created under Barack Obama. It was a policy that goes back to the founding of NATO. And that's what happened here. Second point is, and this is where I did my early work, Putin is fighting an ideological war, right? He's no more threatened by Ukraine and NATO than he is by Estonia already in NATO. The distances from those points to Moscow were basically the same, right? There's no strategic advantage to having Ukraine that isn't already in existence. And Putin would have created rationales to start the war, because what he wants to do is build what he calls this Russian mirror. What he wants to do is reconstruct this historical geographic space of immense power that's controlled fundamentally from Moscow, right? What he calls the Russian world. And that's not going to be dissuadable by NATO, right? And it's not going to be caused by NATO coming into Ukraine. He was building up for this war for years, and it would have happened one way or the other.
Okay, so even without our pushing into NATO, you think it still would have happened. What is the evidence for that, though? What is the evidence that regardless of our feelings about Ukraine and Georgia and NATO, that he would have done this anyway?
If you look at his language, if you look at his speeches already from 1999, you see a consistent theme of proposing an idea called Eurasianism. What this means is that Russia is distinct from Europe. It's not European. It doesn't share those liberal democratic values. It's not Asian. It's something in between. It is what he considers to be what certain theorists, if you remember, I forgot her first name now. If you remember Dugina, the woman who was killed in the car bombing last year, I'm talking about her dad. Her dad is the great theorist of this. His textbook, The Fundamentals of Geopolitics, is the basic textbook in all the Russian military schools, has been for decades. And it essentially says what I'm saying now. It says that Russia is the third Rome. First Rome was in Rome. Second Rome was in Constantinople. Then Constantinople fell to non-Christians. And then the heart of Christianity fell into Moscow and Russian Orthodoxy there. And he feels like that's a threat. It's a threat both militarily by the existence of Western powers that don't share those religious views, and it's a threat, more importantly, by cultural values, right, that are butting up against his border. And that's really the threat. And that's why the tanks, wherever the tanks are placed or the missiles are taken, doesn't change that. He's worried about a Ukraine that becomes westernized.
Well, I can understand your position that he's been talking about some of these expansionist ideas even back in the 90s. But if you take the example of his invasion of Georgia in 2008, at least according to my understanding, is that it came on the heels of the Bush administration saying that they wanted Georgia to join NATO. And this was after, I believe it was Lithuania and some other former Eastern European Soviet satellite countries had already joined NATO. So it seems to me that at least in 2008, there's a direct line between Bush administration saying Georgia's going to join NATO and then the troops going into South Ossetia and Abyssinia, I think is the other province, which
Abkhazia, Abkhazia was already controlled.
Right.
But yeah, right,
okay.
Which is, by the way, gorgeous. I lived in Georgia too for a while.
Oh, did you? Wow.
Yeah. So
a traveled man.
Timing is not necessarily causality. And the question is does Putin go in at that point because the timing is auspicious for him, right? And he wasn't ready before, and so he has to jump in quick, right? Or if that moment hadn't happened, if he'd have gone in a year, 2, 3 years later for some other moment. So again, I think the major reason for going into Georgia, right, is not the same as Ukraine. He doesn't see Georgia as being central to his vision of a Russian world. Ukraine, on the other hand, absolutely is, right? You don't get the Russian world that he's thinking about if you don't have Ukraine. And Georgia was kind of a military test run to see if he could pull this off. When I say military, though, I don't just mean like how the troops move their tanks and shoot. I mean the disinformation campaign that preceded it. I mean the ability to sell this idea that the people in the space that he moved troops into, somehow wanted them to move troops into, right? Somehow invited them. He's trying to build his capacity to sell the idea that his military adventures are valid.
Well, it may have been plausible that Putin was, going to do the Georgia invasion anyway. That's probably right. I just think from the United States perspective, we shouldn't give them that moment. However well-intentioned our intentions were to have those countries join, we gave them the opportunity when, at least in my view, we should have made it more difficult. But perhaps we disagree on that. So let's say Dr. Matthew Schmidt were the president of the United States right now instead of President Joe Biden. How would you handle someone like Vladimir Putin? And I know you're a Russia expert, but I'm also curious how you would handle someone like Xi Jinping, because as we're seeing, these two leaders are becoming friends, as they say, dear friends. What would you do?
I think the big mistake the Biden administration has made was not throwing all in at the beginning, was being too cautious. I think he's done a reasonably good job. I mean, really, basically a very good job in a very complicated situation. But if I had to do something different, I would have thrown in all the way. Give the Ukrainians what they need when they ask for it, and don't make them ask for it, deny it for 2 months, and then dribble it into theater. I think that's caused a lot of problems for them on the battlefield. What I would do right now is do that. Right, is just give them what they need.
What is that? What they need? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to clarify.
Yeah, sure.
What
So
what
they
are
need,
those things?
the problem that they have is that they're butting up against fixed defenses, right? Trenches and things like this. It's like World War I, but with better weapons. The problem is that to get through those minefields and to get through those fixed defenses, men in well-covered trenches and things like that, you need to get over them. You need to go deep into the lines. You need to be able to attack what supplies those trenches, the ammo that gets supplied, so that as you attack them and they expend ammo forward, it's not getting replaced backwards. And eventually you reach a point of sort of parity where you now can be effective in your attack. Specifically, what does that mean? They need ATACMS. They need long-range, rocketry and artillery that we're not giving them right now. They need. It's too late for the F-16, I think, to come in and matter right now. But they needed those, and they needed the airborne capability to get up and over those trenches, to bomb, and to attack the supply routes, right? And they need training. Again, there's not a lot you can do with the training right now. It needed to happen earlier. But the problem that the Ukrainians face is they're not fighting at the division level. They're not fighting in what we call combined arms maneuver. They're fighting at the small unit level, right? It's sort of like when you watch an action movie and like the villain is up there and there's 10 good guys, or no, the good guys up there and there are 10 villains around there, and each one comes at him like one at a time, instead of all of them moving at once, right? The Ukrainians are going one at a time, more or less, in these small units against the Russians. The Russians are doing the same. And if the Ukrainians could fight in bigger numbers simultaneously and synchronized, they would do a lot better.
I bet also if you were President Biden, you would not have said a month before the incursion that, quote, a minor incursion might be acceptable.
Yeah.
That was
absolutely not. No, I was saying the opposite. I was riding on the heads to the opposite.
Yes. And so that was really bad. So okay, understood that you would give the Ukrainians what they want, to put it in your terms. Long term, how would you deal with someone like Putin? What would be some deterrence mechanisms to prevent his ambitions elsewhere and maybe help him from not staying in power for too long?
So this doesn't end when Putin goes.
Right.
This doesn't end when we get the guy after Putin.
Regime change may not be the best thing.
But the guy after Putin is when I think you have the real chance to really start to reform the Russian system.
How do we do that?
Where it has to look at its past and come to terms with the things that were done in its name under the Soviet Union and these sorts of things, and really reform its government. But that's 20 years out. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to be realist, and that's really what I think it is. In the shorter term, I think you need to put pressure on him. You need to make clear statements that, hey, we're going to invite you in, and these are the standards by which we're going to invite you into NATO. And when we come in, we're going to guarantee your borders, right? Maybe we don't guarantee them where you want them. Maybe we guarantee them where they are a year from now, but we're going to guarantee them. So you're signaling to Putin very clearly that this is it. It's all you're going to get. And in the end, this place is going to become part of Europe. It's going to be protected by NATO, and it's going to get very rich relative to the territories that Putin controls very fast. And very quickly, the people in those territories are not going to want to be part of Putin's world anymore. And that's ultimately what I would do, is put pressure on that, and I would engage in a very deep and prolonged covert operation to support anti-regime operatives in Russia. Absolutely.
What would you do with regard to Xi Jinping, who, in addition to being his own flavor of threat to geopolitics, is massively helping Putin and the Russians during this war?
So I don't think he's helping as much as we might think. I think he doesn't want to eliminate his wiggle room. And so he's helping, but he's not helping so much that he can be said to be turning the tide of the war. And I don't think he'll do that at any point. Xi and China in general are an interesting problem for the U.S., right? So for decades, I remember from 1990 on, from when you were born and onwards, that people kept saying, "Oh, China's going to take over the world," and all of this kind of stuff. And then people started to say, "Oh, China's going to grow old because of the one-child policy before it gets rich." Right? And now they're continuing to say that, and they're saying things like the real estate boom that's happening in China is reshaping things, and that in the end, right, by 2050, China's going to be very wealthy, but may not be wealthier than the U.S., may even be a little bit wealthier than the U.S. In any case, right, the top economies are probably going to be China, India, and the U.S. Well, India is a democracy, right? And when you look at population size, it's probably going to be India, then China, possibly us, right? And definitely will be fourth largest country in the world, right? And so I don't think that the dire scenario with China is so dire. And I think that this does put a lot of pressure on Xi to try to telescope forward his goals to create a strong Chinese foreign policy faster, but it may well be faster than he's ready. And I think we basically take the position we've been taking in Republican and Democratic administrations, which is to manage the rise of China, right? And try to avoid direct armed conflict with them and let them wear themselves out. Because in the end, right, our strength is our politics. Our strength is the stability of our political system, and that's what gives us a stable economic system. So even if we're not growing at 17% per annum, right, we're stable.
Yes.
And I think that's what we need to double down on, is to stay stable and let China run itself out.
Hey, whenever someone calls and I'm interviewing, you should answer and put them on the air, make them feel bad for interrupting an interview. I was giving a speech once. There were 400 people, and someone called this guy's phone in the front row, and I said, "Hand over the phone. I'm going to put this person on speaker, and they'll never call during an important interview again." Final quick, my response to you on China is, I hear you about letting China run itself out, and frankly, their demographic problems work to our advantage because the one-child policy is creating this huge problem where too many people are old. But boy, it has been scary to see how much they infiltrate and have infiltrated into American institutions, setting up the Confucius Institutes, buying farmland near our military bases, establishing the spy base on Cuba, manufacturing the fentanyl, sending it to the drug cartels, which are funneling it across our border. So I hope we can let China run itself out, but there's a lot of destruction they can do in the meantime.
Let me just respond to that for a second. Everything you just listed, which is to say it's in public. Now, there are things that are happening that are not in public that the government knows, in addition to everything you just listed that everybody knows. And there are things that are in private that the government doesn't know and that we don't know. But probably the vast majority of what China is doing, somebody knows with some power, either the public or not. So I think we need to be careful to take the list of many, many things and assume that means effectiveness, because I'm not sure that it does. I just don't know that it does. And maybe it does. Maybe it does.
I think it does.
We need to keep the alternate theory in mind that it's possible to be true.
So I just want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that there may be people in our government who have more information that China may not pose as big of a threat to us as we may think?
No. What I'm saying is everything that you listed that China does sounds really scary. But in the end, we know it. And in the end, nobody can really say what it's done. It hasn't tanked the American economy. We've seen no effect on the American military. There's no reason to think that there's going to be major effect because now we know it, right? And whatever other things you think China's doing in private, mostly the government will know what that is, right? And so I'm just saying that we don't want to project onto them more power than they actually have. They're trying a bunch of stuff and they're bungling, right? Well, but they're not necessarily effective just because they're doing a lot.
Well, we'll see. I mean, they have collected so much data on us through TikTok, WeChat, the spy base. They're committing an act of warfare right now. They're hugely succeeding with the manufacturing of fentanyl, sending it to the drug cartels. And they not to mention they have our president bought off. You know, President Biden and his son Hunter have taken bribes from Xi Jinping and other Chinese nationals. So let's hope that nothing will come of it. But I think we're already seeing that it's pretty bad and may only get worse. Quickly, before we end, I'm so curious because you said that you lived in Georgia, and I mentioned in the introduction that you lived in Russia. What was that like? When did you live in those countries, and what was daily life like?
Georgia was fantastic. I took my family there. We were living in Italy actually, and for vacation, I was like, "No, we have to go to Georgia. You have to meet the people I lived with there." And they were like, "Georgia, what?" And then they loved it too. Georgia is like the Riviera of the former Soviet world. It's Mediterranean. The food is amazing, and it's beautiful, right? It's one of the 14,000-foot peaks in the world. There are not that many of those. It's got mountains. It has beaches. It's frankly, it's like California. It's got this incredible topography, built out by seismic zones and things like that. And it was just wonderful. When I went, I was happy to be away out of a lot of the anti-American sentiment that I was living in Russia. So it was a real breath of fresh air to be somewhere where I didn't feel watched all the time, and I felt welcome. So Georgia has a very warm spot in my heart.
I bet. It's so sad that, Americans can't visit these places. I mean, they can, but it's a big chance that you'll end up like Brittany Griner or Evan Gershkovich, who regrettably, obviously, is still in Russia. I actually went to Russia when I was 4 years old. I consider myself to be so lucky to have been able to make that trip. I can't tell you I remember a lot about it. I remember St. Basil's Cathedral, and I thought it was this cupcake tower because of the architecture. But boy, I mean, you would know this better than anyone, but Russia has really fascinating architecture and museums and just a vibrant culture. And it's a big loss among many other more profound losses, but it is still a big loss that we can't go and see that. Thank you, Dr. Schmidt, for joining me. As always, it's a pleasure to speak with you. And thanks especially for making the time at the start of the semester at the University of New Haven. What classes are you teaching?
I'm not. Actually, I'm on sabbatical, working on those books about the Moscow and the end of the war and things like that. So, yeah.
Oh, so you have plenty of time to come on to the show.
Totally plenty of time. Sabbatical does not mean we don't work. It just means we don't teach.
I know. You're writing a book. My gosh. That's hours and hours and hours a day. Well, thank you in any case for making the time. And thank you all so much for joining me. As a reminder, you can hit the subscribe button down below if you liked what you saw today and would like to stay notified with each new video I post. Take care, and I'll see you soon.